All right, so today we're going to continue our conversation about retro principles for the complex needs of a modern world. If you remember last time, I was talking about my grandpa and just what he taught me. Uh, and there's so many lessons, and this is going to be another one that relates to some things that my grandpa taught me. But I want to introduce my new friend, Karl Ebeling. He is he's an individual that I'm finding has deep interest in really the therapeutic effects of gardening, of working together with other people in a setting like that, which is truly a retro principle when you think about it, or it's certainly a rare event these days. It used to happen all the time for all of American society, right?
Yes. In fact, I was talking to somebody who did an agricultural study of Utah, and in the 1960s, 60% of the food that Utahns consume was grown in Utah. And now we're at about 3% of the food. So again, this experience of working in the garden, producing something live, edible, healthy, that has been kind of farmed out, if you will, or given to more national food companies, and that's distanced us from the soil and our roots.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like so many other things, we don't realize how powerful it is until it's been removed or we've lost it, and then we're looking back at it saying, wow, what have we missed out on? What are we not really, benefiting from that we used to, that was just part of everyday life?
Yeah.
And so it was really fun to meet Karl today, because I didn't realize at the day I was going to do a Retro Principles podcast that he would walk in with this retro passion that is needed in our modern world. It made me think about my grandpa, and I mentioned him to you a few minutes ago. And so my grandpa lived to a pretty good age, 93 years old, and this person is really important to me because not only was he my grandpa, but I looked like him from the time I was a little kid. And everybody said, Tim, you look like your grandpa. You act like your grandpa.
Wow.
So there was this draw to try and be more like him. So I've watched him closely. And so when it comes to gardening, this is a really interesting thing about him. I noticed as his life progressed and as he went through the stages of life, his garden went from huge to, over time, it just shrunk a little bit at a time, down to where at the end he was living with my mom and dad, and he had a little corner of a greenhouse.
Wow.
And he was still tending the plants in this little greenhouse.
What, 10 by 10 or?
It was, about like that.
Wow.
And most of the time he was in a wheelchair, and so he'd still get out there and get down in the dirt and crawl back on his wheelchair, but he'd go to work every day, so to speak, in the garden, right? And what do you think? He lived to an old age. He really was healthy during that time. And I think in so many other cases I've looked at, movement and activity, which gardens kind of require.
Yes, and actually,
are a big part of that, right?
Even your hands in the soil. Maybe you're not aware, but there have been studies that the soil is actually a living organism. There's billions of microbes doing their thing, a part of the soil web, and they are actually beneficial. You would, who would think soil? Soil is dirt, right? But actually, there have been studies showing that those who interact with the soil, with the plants, caring for something, producing some food or something beautiful, just like this plant in the studio here, there's something very positive that's going on such that your well-being increases. If I could give an example of this, one of my sons who lives in the Utah Valley here, he's a graduate in IT. So most of his world is working on computers, programs. He does a lot of software development, and that's probably not unique to most of you with children who are into computers. So my other son was getting married, and we had a reception in my sister's backyard. And all the family was called together to work in the backyard, get this backyard ready for a reception. So my son said, okay, this is my computer IT son. He said, all right, I'll help out for just a Saturday morning. And, before he'd been struggling with feelings of anxiety where he just uneasy about things, worry, whatever it was. And he came with those kind of feelings to my sister's house and knocked on the door. Said, oh, great, you're here? Let me give you a tool. So he got a weeder, a hoe, a rake, and there were some other of my family members in the backyard. And, I learned this third person, but I asked him, how did that experience go? And he said, you know what? When I finished my couple of hours working in the garden, I felt like all that anxiety was lifted, like I could breathe again. And I said, what was the cause of that? Of course, me, Farmer Karl, that's my code name here. But, I'm convinced that there's an interaction when we're with other people in the garden, and even when we're interacting with the soil and the plants, beautifying, creating order, there's something very fundamental going on with our psyche.
So that's why I feel good, even though I'm weeding the garden.
Yeah, I mean,
I used to try to avoid that as a kid, but I actually enjoy it.
And weeding by yourself, I would say,
not as
fun. That's really punishment. But when you're with a group of people where you're working in the garden, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and we had a church farm where we grew tomatoes for Del Monte, and we sold the produce so that we could get money for helping the poor out. And that experience, we were 20 guys rolling out black plastic, putting holes in the plastic, planting these tomato plants and putting on the little fertilizer. I will never forget the feeling that I had. We were a camaraderie. We were a team. And I really believe that we're lacking that in our society today.
Absolutely. I think so. You've walked into the barn today, and you've learned a little bit about the history of the barn, and you notice that we've got a lot of our own family working here with us at Homeward Bound and at Ralliest, our other company. But on the walls, and all of you can't see this, but we have a couple signs up there. One of them says Paisley Farms, and it was an all-natural hog and beef farm that we created and worked on together as a family. And we have the Thayne barn over here, another sign that is really about a little business we did out of the barn here, where our kids were milking cows here in the city. So the setting is we are on a 2-acre plot in the middle of Lehi, Utah. It was intentional to try and have a place where, and I didn't have the science behind it like you do. I didn't understand really fully what it was. In some ways, it was like about work for me, trying to help my kids learn how to work. But definitely getting into nature, getting our hands dirty, creating gardens, growing something has been very helpful to our family.
Yeah, so. And that brings to mind the experiences that I'm having in Philadelphia. I'm currently on the suburbs of Philadelphia, and part of my Grow Life nonprofit organization is to reach out to foster children across Philadelphia I'm partnering with an organization called Northern Children's Services. And so for 2 seasons, we're working with 10 to 13-year-olds who are in a home situation that's largely not your ideal family. They may or may not have a parent. They may not eat dinner together. Cheetos and some of the basics, pizza, make sure it's pizza and Cheetos, And so when they get out in the garden, the wonder that I see in their expressions, it's so priceless. It's worth all the effort that I put into creating this experience for them. We have 16 raised beds, 4x4, and they get to plant in them. There were 6 African American, Latin American kids, from all countries, nationalities. They were in the soil with their hands, and you would think, what are you doing in the soil? But it was like filling an innate need they had to connect with the earth and what they were growing.
That's awesome, and that's really part of your vision, isn't it? To use this innate important thing that we've kind of lost touch with, getting back into the soil, getting growing our own food and healthy. You're wanting to use that to help youth in general. And tell us a little bit more about what your vision is.
So there's a couple elements of what I'm trying to do, but it all centers around the principle of inviting society back to the garden. In fact, I'm working on a book called Come Back to the Garden. Because even since Adam and Eve, we learn about the garden, and the name human comes from humus, which actually stems from of the dust. And even the name Adam has linkages to the soil. And when you understand why the garden was created, it was for us to have joy and happiness. And it was 2 people interacting in the garden, tending, cultivating, tilling, interacting with this beautiful nature that was created for our well-being. And that interaction is what I am trying to propose and a model, if you will. How do we bring the garden back into modern society?
I love that, Karl. The thing that comes to mind, it's almost a little mini wilderness in a sense, right? So I, was a co-founder of a wilderness treatment program, and having kids in that nature, that natural environment, and of course they get dirty, by the way.
I really enjoy getting my hands a little dirty because it's so different than the office work that I'm doing. It connects with me in a new level.
So there's definitely a piece of that. Even a lot of the parents that might listen to this, they may have had a child in a therapeutic program of some type, or maybe their child is struggling in some ways right now. And some of them probably know about these wilderness programs, and they have seen the transformation that takes place, and we call it kind of a therapeutic milieu.
Yes,
it's like an environment that you've sort of designed on one hand in terms of how you interact with the kids and what the activities are, and the therapeutic component of that environment. But the natural part of it that you really can't create, it's there and you're interacting with it. We probably are under, maybe we're not seeing the full benefit of the fact that the setting itself, the nature, and even maybe the dirt.
Exactly.
After talking to you, I'm starting to question that and even wonder maybe, all those billy baths we're having them take, it's okay if they get a little dirty.
Yes. Yeah. So. And you're mentioning that it brings to mind what's going on in Missoula, Montana. They have an organization called Youth Harvest, and these are youth typically in the 16 to 25 year age, educated youth. In other words, they've had some interaction with the law. Let's say they're on probation, And typically that involves some court proceeding where they say, okay, you have so many hours of community service. And the beautiful thing about what's going on in Missoula is they have Garden City Harvest, which is an organization fostering community agriculture and that experience. And they actually work in tandem. They have 5 educated youth with probably 12 to 20 university students who are studying environmental science and community ag. And you can watch a TED Talk by Josh Schlotnick called Community Farming. It's not about the food. But what he brings out is, and I was just there yesterday in Missoula talking to the lead farmer, Dave Victor. He said, it's amazing to watch the chemistry of what's going on. The first week, everybody's kind of like to themselves. They don't know what to think. And they start working in the soil. They start seeding these little plants together. And the second week, you start to see things gel. The third week, they are one united team. And he said, the people, somehow the chemistry of working in nature, in the garden, with each other, has produced some amazing results. So I just wanted to bring that out as an example that year over year, I think they've been doing this for 12, 15 years. It's transforming youth lives.
That's fantastic. You know, it makes me wonder, Karl, what could parents do? Okay, so we're going to have to brainstorm here a little bit. What if they're living in a city, an urban environment? And is there anything they can take from these principles you're talking about right now that would help their child or their youth who may be struggling in some way?
That's a great question. I think there are parks. It's a great resource in any city, and the idea is how do you get to the point where you're actually generating. I see parks as a passive activity. When you're in a park, you're experiencing that. But I think what you're asking is, how can you be an active participating in creating new life in the garden? Certainly there's horticultural societies. The 4-H tends to be in the rural setting. So what one of my visions is that Grow Life would be a charterable organization. So like-minded people in communities can establish the very basics of how do you get a couple of raised beds together on a section of a property where the community can come together.
Yeah. You know, I think when I was first married, brand newlywed, my wife Roxanne and I were in an apartment building. And the farmer in me wanted homegrown tomatoes. And so there was hardly any dirt anywhere, but there was one little square of dirt outside our apartment, and we planted two small tomato plants.
Yeah.
And we nurtured that over the next little while, and all of our neighbors knew about these 2 tomato plants.
They were like your children.
Yeah, and it was really fun. That was just one of those things we did. You know, I feel like even, there's levels of what could happen. I remember planting a little bean in a cup.
Yeah.
And it got enough sunlight that you put it in the window and water it, and you can see that sprout. So I would say that there's probably even something as small as that could have some kind of an effect, right?
Yes, and I can't be stopped. My wife says, all right, you're going to do your garden this year, and I'm in the basement. I have my seeding trays. I have my heating mat underneath, and I did tomatoes, eggplant. And what I did is I invited some kids over, and I said, hey, how would you like to work with me on these plants? And I gifted them the plants that I had grown. And just this last year, this 7-year-old says, oh, you've got to come to our house. Look what I've done. And I came to her house. We had a pizza party. She had this tomato plant that was 4 feet tall, filled with tomatoes. She said, look what my plant is that you gave me. Look what you've done.
Awesome.
And so the realization is giving a plant and giving a child an experience like that in the garden, even if it's at your home or they start out somehow planting a bean seed and letting that grow, all of that can engender this love of nature and the benefit of feeling like, wow, isn't this a miracle I'm watching? And I'm caring for something now that's giving life back to me.
And, just to kind of wrap up here, I feel like, in a day and age like we are today, and you described your son in front of a screen a lot for his job and what he's doing there.
Yeah.
And really all of us are now like that. Most of us are like that, in front of a screen a lot. I think we have to be very deliberate, take those moments of time to get away from the screen, get outside. Part of it's probably just outside, right? Get to the park, spend some time in the yard, grow a little plant, just find ways to get back to nature and away from screens. And that alone is bound to make us, it's going to lift our spirits, if nothing else, right? It's going to lift our spirits like it did your son. So let's keep using the word here, cultivating this idea, with what we can do in our families and use this retro principle in this crazy, sometimes complex, busy world where we don't slow down and get back to the basics. And I really appreciate you, Karl, and I love your passion for this. I really, I think you're gonna continue to continue to expand this and make a difference for a lot of kids. So thanks for coming by today and impromptu podcast.
Such an amazing opportunity to meet you and at the same time be invited on this podcast in the same day.
It's really fun.
I just want to thank Tim for allowing me to share my passion, and it's just a testimonial over and over again what I see change in the lives of our young people, that I hope that you can take some part of this and make it useful for you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.